Hello and welcome to our lesson on integers, specifically identifying and representing integers. So first off, we will need to know what an integer is. So by definition, an integer is a positive whole number, 0, or a negative whole number. So positive numbers, their opposites, and 0. And we'll say positive whole numbers. That word there, whole numbers, is the most important part because what makes something not an integer is having a remainder, a fractional piece besides the whole number. So positive whole numbers and their opposites. And that is including 0, because 0 is neither positive nor negative. So 0 is that special case. So an example of a positive whole number. So what's a whole number? Sometimes you might hear round to the nearest whole number, like if something costs $7.99. Why does it have arrows? Weird. I don't want arrows. So if something costs $7.99 to the nearest whole dollars, it would cost $8. This is a whole number. Even though it has a decimal, it's a whole number. It's 8 whole dollars, $8. So the nearest whole number, this is an integer. This is an integer. This is not an integer. It is not a whole number. You also have negative numbers. So in addition to the positive whole numbers, we have negative whole numbers. So we know that positive 8 is an integer. So here's the integer list. Positive 8, an integer. Positive 8.00, an integer. Positive 8.00000 is still an integer. These are not integers. These are not positive or negative whole numbers or 0. Things like 8.1, 8.0000001 now makes it not an integer. 8.5, not an integer. Really, it's just the counting numbers. I think you don't really want to overthink this. It's numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the numbers that you would count. I won't say that they're all just whole numbers, because whole numbers, this word over there, consists of the numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So integers include a little bit more than that. The opposites, which would be -1, -2, -3, -4, and it keeps going on and on forever in both directions. Really, integers are whole numbers, whether they're positive or negative, and 0 is considered to be an integer. As long as you know that, this unit should be pretty easy. You really have to know one thing: what is an integer, what is not an integer. I can't think of anything else. I can show you a few examples, but really this unit is pretty quick. Just getting some practice with it. I think that's all you need. So things like temperatures can be written as integers, which are negative numbers. So things that also have negative numbers would be considered integers. Not only negatives, but positives also. So if you're asking yourself, is it an integer? Well, is it a whole number that's positive or negative? Then yes, it's an integer. Does it have a fraction remainder like 8.2 or 8.25? Then it's not an integer. If it has a decimal remainder like 1.115, not an integer. 1.00 is an integer. And to write integers, all numbers have a sign, whether it's there or not. Sometimes The positive version, we don't write positive. Like if we wanted to say -5, you'd write negative, and then the whole number 5. That's the integer -5. It means the opposite of 5. When we write 5, that means +5. So a lot of times we won't write that positive sign. It's just implied that 5 is the positive version, unless it says it's negative. If it says it's negative, then it is negative. If it doesn't say anything, it's positive. So like 7, we can just infer that that's a +7. You can't infer that this is -7 unless the negative is there. So the negative will always be there. The positive is kind of situational. Sometimes you'll see it, sometimes it won't be there. So let's take a look at some examples, see if you can guess if they are integers or not. We got -3 is an integer. It's a negative whole number. 10 is an integer. It's a positive whole number. 1/2, not an integer. It is not a whole number. It's part of a number. It's half of a number. If you paid half of $1 for something, you'd pay 50 cents. Not a whole number. If we rounded it to the nearest whole number, it would be 1. To the nearest integer, 1. We got -3/4. Not an integer. Not a negative whole number. So if we had 0 here, we have 1. These are two integers. You have -1, that's an integer. -3/4, here's -1/2. Here's -1/4. Here's -3/4. So this would be -1/4, -1/2, and -3/4. So this is not an integer. It does not fall on one of the whole numbers. All right, we have 10/2. 10/2's a little bit tricky. It is a whole number. 10/2, or 10 divided by 2, equals 5. 5 is an integer. If I had 5 candy bars and I split them each in half, I'd still have 5 candy bars. I would just have 10 half candy bars. Same amount, 5 wholes. 5 wholes is a whole number. Whole numbers are integers. If it were 11/2, not an integer. If it's 11 1/4, 11.25, not an integer. -7.0 is an integer. -8.1, that 0.1 makes it not an integer. Integers fall on the integer number line of whole numbers. If it's between two integers, then it's not an integer. So is an integer not an integer? It's between two. You can't be between two integers and be an integer at the same time. Between two integers, not an integer. Is an integer. Is an integer. Remember, 0 is. So we have negative integers, we have positive integers, and we have 0, which is neither positive nor negative. All right. That is really it for this. I'm going to try to keep it short. Next lesson will be on comparing integers. How could we compare -8 to -5? Which one's more, which one's less? If it's -8 degrees outside or -7 degrees outside, what's colder?